So the next speaker is actually Dr. Betchaida Payot. She is currently Associate Professor and Deputy Director for Research and Development at the University of the Philippines, NIGS, or National Institute of Geological Sciences. She got her BS and MS from the University of the Philippines and finished her PhD also in Japan. She joined the faculty in she joined the faculty in 2013 through the UP Balik PhD program. She is an igneous petrologist and geochemist. Her research works focus on the formation of igneous rocks and deciphering processes occurring in the deeper portions of the Earth. Dr. Payot was recently awarded as an outstanding young scientist by the National Academy of Science and Technology here in the Philippines. So Dr. Payot, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Ma'am Alisa, for the introduction. Can you hear me well? Is the audio okay?
Yes, yes.
So, good morning, everyone.
It's a little faint. It's a little
Good morning, everyone.
Yeah, okay.
Good morning, everyone. My presentation for today is entitled Xenoliths in the Philippines, Examples and Significance. And for my presentation, please be guided by this outline. And to start with, let me just define the term xenoliths because there might be some people here who are not so familiar with this term. So the term xenolith actually came from the Greek word xenos, meaning foreign, and lithos, meaning rock. So basically, it means that a piece or a rock fragment is trapped within another type of rock. As you can show here on the left panel, we have a harsh pergite, which is a rock type typical of the mantle, surrounded or included within basalts, which are commonly formed or erupted during volcanic eruptions. And the more important point here is, why do we study these xenoliths, even if they are such tiny rock fragments? If you focus your attention here on the right panel, this is a cartoon or a schematic diagram showing the formation of an island arc system. And as you may all know, the Philippines is actually an island arc system. So what are the elements present here? We see that there is a subducting oceanic lithosphere. This is the overriding plate. And because of this subduction, we could have partial melting occurring at depths. And through this partial melting, we actually create magma or generate magma in the arc system. And once you have a sufficient amount of magma present at these depths, this magma rises up, and eventually, if it is successful in reaching the surface, we observe this as volcanic eruptions. So the importance of this xenoliths is that it actually provides us information to the otherwise inaccessible depths of the Earth. So if you take note here, this would be depending on which point you are on the surface of the Earth, but the depths could range from roughly 15 to at least 100 kilometers for this particular partial melt, for this magma generation to actually happen. So there are several reported known localities here in the Philippines for xenoliths, and one of those would be Mount Iraya here in the Batanes group of islands. The second one would be in Monglo in Baguio, and another one here in Western Luzon in Mount Pinatubo. So for this particular research work, we actually studied xenoliths collected from Sabtang Island, which is another island in the Batanes group of islands. And then the second locality we investigated was Mount Pinatubo. So the main motivation for this work was to actually use these xenoliths to determine what types of processes actually occurs beneath the Luzon Arc. So this is a map showing the northern part of the Philippines and the tectonic elements present in the area. So this would be the Philippine Mobile Belt. This is the South China Sea Basin, which is currently subducting along the Manila Trench. And because of this subduction, we actually form the Luzon Arc, which is shown here in this figure by this orange field. So the Luzon Arc is a series of volcanoes stretching from the southern part of Taiwan all the way down here to the south in the northern portion of Mindoro. And the study area in this work, Sabtang Island, is located in the second segment of this Luzon Arc, which is called the Batanes segment, as enclosed here by this box. And if you look at the figure on the right, this shows the different group of islands present in the area. So the Batan, the volcano in Batan, as well as other volcanoes to the south, in Camigan de Baboyanes, as well as Mount Cagua in northeastern Luzon, actually comprises the quaternary and active volcanoes of the East Volcanic Chain. And then to the west, we also observe Miocene volcanoes present in Itbayat, Sabtang, the Babuyan group of islands, and these volcanoes actually comprise the West Volcanic Chain. So the study area is Sabtang Island, and it is located in this portion here, and it forms part of the WVC, or the West Volcanic Chain. And this is zooming in on the Sabtang Island. So this is a geologic map showing the different formations present in the area. So the island has a very simple geology. It has it's comprised of the Chavayan volcanic complex, Sabtang breccia, the Sabidug limestone, and for the xenoliths that we collected, these were found in association with the Sabtang breccia as well as the Chavayan volcanic complex. And this is how the samples look like in the field. So the host rock was basically andesite. So most of these host rocks, or the rocks surrounding these xenoliths, are andesite. And we observe different lithologies as xenoliths. So first we have here dunite. We have clinopyroxenites, gabbros, as well as hornblendites. Then we analyze these samples under the microscope, and this is how they look like. For those who are not so familiar with this type of images, it just means that we polished and made the rock sections very thin, enough that light can be transmitted through it, and then you can observe this under the microscope. So these are actually images taken and using a microscope. And the first two panels, A and B, shows the coarse grain type of texture we observe in the dunite. So we see here grains of olivine, and then smaller grains of orthopyroxene. Also here in the second panel, the light green colors are olivine. And then we also see the grayish one overlying this, replacing this olivine, which we identified as orthopyroxene. And in addition to this coarse grain type of dunites, we also observe the fine grain type, as shown here in panel C. So these tiny minerals are actually fine grained olivine. And then lastly, alongside with these dunites, we also observe orthopyroxenites such as this one. So in this particular sample, all these radial aggregates are actually orthopyroxene. So the main takeaway from this slide is that the coarse grained olivine, or the original minerals present in the sample, actually reacted or were actually altered because they reacted with some sort of silica-rich fluids, forming this secondary orthopyroxene. And if the reaction actually progressed or is completed, we think that the orthopyroxenite, so this rock type, which is now completely composed of orthopyroxene, was actually generated through this particular process. So in addition to dunites and orthopyroxenites, we also observed under the microscope the clinopyroxenites, gabbros, and hornblende. So here in this panel, this light brown stuff would be clinopyroxene, and this darker brown stuff would be hornblende. So for my students, they should be able to remember, or for my students who are here today, I often teach this in class, that clinopyroxene if you put it in the presence of water, it's usually altered to hornblende. And this is a very classic example of that. So we see the hornblende sort of already starting to replace the primary clinopyroxene in this particular sample. In addition, this panel here is for the gabbros, and we can see that these are the plagioclases. These are patches of clinopyroxene, and at the same time, we also observe the occurrence of hornblende here. And then in the lower panel, these letters G and H, these are photomicrographs of hornblendites. So it means that the samples are now completely just composed of hornblende. So if we relate this to our to the dunites and orthopyroxenites, in this type of lithologies, we also see alteration or metasomatism in the form of the alteration of the clinopyroxenes to hornblende. And we analyzed these samples using the electron probe microanalyzer at UP Needs. And for the first panel, I'm sorry it's a bit busy because there's a lot of data plotted here. But first, this type of diagrams are commonly used for this type of pathological studies. And the first diagram shows us nickel weight percent versus olivine forsterite content. And olivine is a typical mineral in ultramafic rocks, or particularly in peridotites such as dunite. And as I mentioned earlier, the diagram is a bit busy, but kindly focus on the squares because that's our data. And the other points here, or the other data set here, are data from other xenoliths in other ARC localities. So what is the main point of this diagram? We can clearly see that if this is the olivine mantle array, most of our samples actually plot from this field. So you see here, there's a lot of boxes just plotting away from this field, and some of the samples appear to follow this line here, which is what patrologists call as the fractional crystallization trend after Takahashi and others in 1986. And then on the other, on this right side panel, this field here bounded by these two lines would be the olivine spinel mantle array. So if the rock is actually typical or were formed in the mantle, then we should expect that this the sample should plot within this field. We should plot within the osma. But as you can clearly see, our samples actually plot outside of this field, and it seemed to follow these arrows indicated as fractionation trend. So the main takeaway from these two slides is that most probably our samples are not really mantle-derived samples. So the dunite that we are looking at is not were generated at shallower depths. They were formed by a fractional crystallization and were most probably cumulate in origin. And we also look at the mineral chemistry of the gabbros. So on the left side, you're looking at magnesium number versus Al2O3 content for the clinopyroxene. And the highlight here is that this blue diamonds would be clinopyroxenes in the clinopyroxenite, which shows lower Al2O3 weight percent and higher magnesium number compared to the gabbros. And then here on the second panel, we see anorthite content of the plagioclase and then plotted against the clinopyroxene magnesium number. So as we can clearly see here, the plagioclase shows high anorthite content. And this is, which is actually common for plagioclases in arc magmas. So basically these two diagrams indicate indicate formation of these rock types in the presence of arc or hydrous magmas. And so for the highlights for the Sabtang Island, so basically we found different lithologies ranging from dunite, clinopyroxenites, hornblende gabbros, as well as hornblendite xenoliths. And we think that these were formed as cumulates at the basal section of the volcanic island arc. So it based on our density and pressure calculations after Jaguts and Ben in 2013, we think that these rocks were formed at least at 21 to 26 kilometers for the gabbros. And for the clinopyroxenites, we think they were generated or formed at depths of 15 to 32 kilometers. So this values actually corresponds to the cross-mantle boundary beneath island arc systems. And another highlight that we observed is that all the types of lithologies we observed actually show or recorded some sort of alteration because of their interaction with silica-rich fluids, which percolated in these different rock types. So that's for the data we had on Satang Island. And moving on, we go to Mount Pinatubo, which is located here in Western Luzon. So I guess everybody is quite familiar with Mount Pinatubo because it infamously erupted on June 15, 1991, as also mentioned by Dr. Sulidum this morning. And this is the present day crater of Mount Pinatubo, which was formed after the 1991 eruption. It's quite a nice view, but unfortunately for our study, we didn't actually find any xenoliths here. So we collected the xenoliths in Mount Pinatubo from the lahar deposits along the O'Donnell River, which is one of the major rivers draining Mount Pinatubo. So just to give you an idea how big or how wide this sampling area was, these are my colleagues. This is Arai Sensei, my professor from Kanazawa University, and Yoshikawa-san of Kyoto University during the time when we collected the sample. So what we did was just walk around this area and trying to find some mantle-looking rocks. And fortunately, we were lucky and we found this type of rocks. So we found coarse-grained mantle xenoliths as well as fine-grained mantle xenoliths. So for this panel on the left, these are very typical of what we call as mantle peridotites. So the very greenish color is due to the presence of olivine or peridote. So kaya siya green in color. And then here on the right side, we also see the fine-grained type of xenoliths. And because it is fine-grained, we cannot clearly discern the mineral boundaries comprising this particular lithologies. And we collected quite a lot of samples. We gathered about 90 samples. And in terms of lithological variation, these were dominantly harsh vergites and dunites. But we were lucky enough to actually find one rare spinel leurzolite. I'll be explaining the importance of this sample in the succeeding slides. So it's quite tiny. It's just this big. However, we got a lot of info from this particular sample. And this, again, we did petrographic work. So these are some photomicrographs of the leurzolite. And the leurzolite actually shows typical porphyroclastic texture, usually associated or usually observed in mantle peridotites. And if we look at the mineralogy, it's very classic. You have olivine, clinopyroxenes, orthopyroxenes, as well as reddish-brown spinels, such as these ones here. And then to a certain extent, we also see some sort of alteration. You can see here that the clinopyroxene is actually mantled by amphibole. And this other panel here just shows us the abundance of clinopyroxene in this leurzolite, because for a rock type to be called a leurzolite, there should be at least more than 5% modal occurrence of clinopyroxenes and orthopyroxenes. So this lower panel shows us beautiful grains of clinopyroxene occurring in this leurzolite. And for the harsh vergites, we observe, preserve, as well as metasomatized or altered textures. So here in the upper panel, these are the typical textures in the coarse-grained harsh vergites, which has primary orthopyroxene, olivine, spinel, as well as a bit of amphibole. But here in the second panel, we clearly see advanced stages of metasomatism or alteration. So we see spinel, some olivine here, And then we also see the occurrence of amphiboles as well as secondary orthopyroxene. And as discussed earlier for subdung, we often say that this secondary orthopyroxene is formed due to the interaction of the original material in the periodotite with that of the arrival or the occurrence of fluids. And for mineral chemistry, again, these are some diagrams normally we usually use for this type of studies. So the first one actually shows data for spinel. Spinel is a very important mineral in studying mantle peridotites because even if alteration happens, supposedly spinel is not easily altered. So it keeps a record of the magmatic process under experienced by the rocks. So here on the x-axis, this is magnesium number, or basically a measure of the ratio of magnesium and iron. And here on the y-axis, this is chromium number, a measure of the ratio of chromium and aluminum. So if we look at the data for the luzolite and harshbergites from Mount Pinatubo, we see that they show a wide range of chromium number from this point until here for the luzolite. But for the luzolite, we can clearly see that they tend to cluster at the lower chromium values compared to the harshbergites. And then here in panel B, we also see, again, olive-iron forsterite content plotted against nickel oxide weight percent. And here we can see that this is most of the samples actually plot within the olivine mantle array. So a lot of them actually falls within this field here. And then in the lower panel, this is a graph showing spinel chromium number versus the sodium oxide present in the clinopyroxene. So we see very, very low values for the of sodium in the clinopyroxene in the luzolite. Again, this is a typical geochemical signature for abyssal peridotites. So the main takeaway here is it seemed like that these peridotites are actually derived from the mantle. And but if we look at the details, where as shown here in this diagram, we see olivine forsterite content versus spinel chromium number. And again, we plot here the data that we have for the luzolites as indicated by the blue diamonds, and the harshbergites are indicated by the circles. So if we just follow partial melting process in the mantle wedge or during the partial melting event, we should expect that the rock type should follow this orange line here. So this is the partial melting trend. So as the partial melting increases, we would expect that the sample becomes, the olivine in the samples will show higher forsterite content and higher spinel chromium number. And then on the other hand, if we focus our attention to this set of harshbergites here, it seemed like that these samples actually show shifted or lower olivine forsterite values. So it's plotting towards this lower forsterite value content. So this signifies that maybe the luzolite, which shows very clear abyssal, or which shows affinity as which shows abyssal affinity, is not directly related to the harshbergites. Kasi yun nga, iba yung trend nitong pinapakita ng harshbergites. So if they were correlated with each other, we should expect that this harshbergite should have plotted somewhere around this part of the diagram. And actually this arrow here also indicates the metasomatized trend for the Abacha xenoliths in Russia. And it seemed like our harshbergites from Mount Pinatubo tend to mimic or at least plot towards this direction. So what is the highlight for the Mount Pinatubo xenoliths? The first one is that the luzolite might be a preserved fertile mantle material. So it because of its geochemical signatures showing low chromium spinel and all that, as well as its textures, we think that it is a fertile mantle material. And then for the Hirschbergites, especially those showing advanced stages of alteration, we think they signify or they represent materials metal somatized in the subarc mantle. And in this case, in the paper that we did for this work, we actually suggested that the Lurzoline may represent abyssal peridotites. And then because of the presence of fluids in the subduction zone or in the mantle wedge area, these are slowly converted to arc peridotites as shown as are indicated by the presence of metasomatized Hirschbergites in the area. So in conclusion, Sabtang Island xenoliths form as cumulates as the basal section of the arc. And then for Mount Pinatubo, we see here records of the fertile mantle beneath Luzon Arc, as well as the metasomatic or the alteration produced from the presence of fluids in this region beneath the Luzon Arc. And lastly, through these studies, we were able to show that by studying xenoliths, we can have an idea what types of processes are actually occurring beneath the Luzon Arc. And for those who are interested about the details of this study, I would like to recommend the papers that we wrote or we published on this topic. So the first one would be on the Sabtang Island. This was published by Mr. Gabriel Barrera, who was my master's thesis advisee at the time he published this paper, but he's now currently with Kyoto University doing his PhD. And then the second paper would be on the Mount Pinatubo xenoliths. This paper got published 2 years ago in 2018, and Minerals is actually an open access journal, so you can freely download this paper. But anyway, if you are interested, you can email me or send me a message through Facebook, and I can give you a copy of this paper. And then I would like to extend my thanks to the following institutions for making this study possible. And in particular, I would like to personally thank Dr. or Ma'am Giselle Concepcion, who is here today with us, because actually the funding for this work was provided by her program, the UP Balik PhD program, when she was the Vice President of the Office of Academic Affairs in UP Diliman the year I got back or I was hired in UP. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Betch. And I wonder if Dr. Aurelio is now also connected again.
I'm in, Alicia. I'm in.
Okay, thank you. So we'll have some of the questions. I think your reply to Brian Marfito wasn't completed earlier, Dr. Aurelio.
Yes, I was about to complete when Zoom booted me out.
Okay. So should you read it
yes,
again?
So no, I'm okay. I think it was already read earlier. So yes.
I'm sorry, Dr. Aurelio, would you like to reply to it?
Okay. I'm going through the question now. Rather than using aftershocks, are there other ways to validate if there is an increase or decrease in stress on active faults? So I was saying a while ago that there's this group of seismologists and seismic engineers or earthquake engineers that are suggesting that we can monitor the stress increase or decrease of an area after an earthquake by monitoring water wells. Because in the water wells, they think that the increase in stress or decrease in stress should be reflected in the wells themselves. In other areas, they do borehole monitoring, in situ stress measurements on boreholes. So if there are existing drill holes, or if you have the budget, you drill a hole into the ground as deep as you can, and then there are ways to measure, there are calipers to measure the stresses in those areas. Unfortunately, in the Philippines, it is not quite a common methodology yet, except for geothermal companies. They do in situ stress measurements, as well as petroleum companies. But they do this big for their own purposes. Meaning, for example, for the petroleum companies, they would be interested in the pressures that are involved in the buildup of the petroleum deposit, for example. But for earthquake studies, it would be good if we can also adopt those techniques. But then it's really costly. It's an expensive exercise. What could possibly explain an increase of aftershocks on an area with a decrease in stress after the 2012 Negros earthquake? I don't know, Brian. I don't know yet, Brian. Perhaps in the future we'll be able to understand. But there could be other factors, as I said. It's not only a matter of one earthquake triggering another. There could be others. And who knows, these faults are actually just behaving independently from one another, but in general, controlled or influenced by a regional regime, which in the Philippines would be a compressional regime at the moment, as we are living in this geodynamic period, which is the compressional regime from the Philippine Sea Plate moving towards the Eurasian Plate. Okay. So should I proceed reading the other questions, Dr.
I guess,
Alisa, or?
the one from Grace Bato, I think she was putting that encoding it while you were talking about your unechelon faults.
Okay. So should I go ahead and read the questions and try to answer them?
Yeah.
Okay. So Grace, actually I've been also chatting with her privately before I got booted out. Doc Au, have you looked at any post-seismic deformation that may confirm the stress changes that you observe beneath Mount Apo? We attempted doing that when we went back a few weeks later when we were starting to do the geophysical investigation of the Anachelon cracks. It is difficult really in the field to decipher any post-seismic deformation. Certainly a remote sensing procedure like an INSAR, interferometric analysis, would be able to do that, but you'll have to run a pass again over the area and see if there is any deformation. And really, it should be a very good technique or methodology to employ in order to see if there's any post-seismic deformation. Very, very good suggestion, Grace. In Mount Apo, okay, so in Mount Apo, I mentioned a while ago that for the geophysical investigation, we collaborated with our colleagues at EDC. And we were also informed that FIVOLX actually is monitoring the volcano now in terms of its seismicity. There is a seismic station there, as well as EDC also has lots of, it has a network of seismic monitoring stations for purposes of the geothermal field actually, but are now being also delegated or designated, at least some of them, to monitor the volcano seismically. But deformation-wise, I'm not really sure. Certainly, there should be an activity now to monitor the volcano, whether it is bulging or not, which could be an indication that the stress buildup is true underneath the volcano. By the way, this also now answers a question by Rene Riesa, because he is asking for what evidence would you need for a more definitive conclusion that stress buildup in nearby volcanoes are indeed happening. So I answered in the chat box actually that really the logical procedure would be to monitor the volcano in terms of its seismicity. Could be micro seismicity, very small earthquakes, as well as the ground deformation, whether it's moving, it's bulging or not. And otherwise, as I also mentioned, similar to my answer to Brian, you can do in situ stress measurements, but that would be, as I said, very costly because if you don't have an existing well, and this should be open wells actually, wherein you can put in a caliper to measure the in situ stress. I know that at EDC, at least in the Tongonan geothermal field, they do this regularly for purposes of the geothermal plant. Okay.
I guess
From Deo Llamas, who is yes,
Mario,
sorry.
maybe is it possible for you to reply to him on chat? It's we are a little bit behind on time, so maybe you can
Okay.
reply to him on
Yeah,
chat.
just to mention that Deo is also one of my advisees.
I know.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
But these are not
So si
these are
Doc-
not planted questions,
no,
mind you.
I don't believe you, Doctor. No, joking. So,
Yeah,
si
okay.
Betch naman,
Okay.
Dr. Payot.
I'm
Oh,
fine.
thank you, Mario.
I'm fine.
Betch, could you explain further the difference between abyssal and arc peridotites in general? This is from Dr. Maglambayan.
Thank you, Sir Vic. Actually, when we say abyssal peridotites, we refer to peridotites formed in the oceanic setting, so preferably at mid-oceanic ridges. And then when we refer to arc peridotites, normally this would be the mantle peridotites occurring in the mantle wedge, so that triangular feature between the subducting slab and the overriding plate. So basically, these are two distinct tectonic settings. However, for the xenoliths in Mount Pinatubo, we found them together. So this actually suggests that to a certain extent, the mantle materials beneath Mount Pinatubo is not homogeneous. And we think there's a mixture there of fertile as well as depleted materials, as indicated by the presence of the fertile lherzolite as well as depleted harshbergites in the suite of xenoliths that we collected in the area.
There was also a question from Julius Pasco, and actually I was also interested in it. Aside from Baguio, Batanes, and Pinatubo, are there any reports or any possibilities, dinagdag ko yun, of other mantle xenolith localities in the Philippines? For example, Taal and Mayon, would it be possible?
Yes, actually, we also went to Mayon and we collected some samples for, we collected some xenoliths from Mayon, but they were rather limited, and most of the samples were gabbros, as well as most of these xenoliths were gabbroic or gabbros, and I actually have one student who was working on this one, and we're still waiting, finalizing our results. For Taal, I'm not so sure if there is somebody from FIVOX or those who are working there who can provide information. I'd be very much interested to work on xenoliths from Taal. But given the presence of numerous volcanoes in the Philippines, I would expect that there should be other localities where we could find xenoliths. Maybe it's just that at this moment, they're not yet recognized or reported yet. So I'll take this as an opportunity to make to ask a favor for geologists who will be doing fieldworks in volcanoes. If you do find xenoliths, please let me know. I'll be very much interested to work on them and to add to the database of xenoliths that we actually have here in the Philippines.
Thank you, Betch. I'd like to, as an interim, I'd like to recognize the people in the audience. Dr. Yumol is here. Dr. De Leon Tutsi, I believe, is here on her phone. Lisa Manzano, Rene Riesa, of course. Bebet Jamampo, a biologist from UPLB. Dr. Nina Cadiz is also listening to us, as well as Paul and Denny Bernabe. Rex Kamit, I guess, from Canada. Dr. Tariela, of course, yung mga nami-mention, yung mga oldies, ha? So, pag di kayo na-mention, yang pa kayo. Siyempre, dapat isama ko si Dr. De Silva para oldies siya kaagad. Of course, our former director, Dr. Vic Maglambayan, along with Dr. Yumul, also was a former director. Geologist, Dean of in the College of Arts and Sciences in UP Baguio, Dean D. Javier also is here. We also have Bing Vargas from PNRI. And of course, Si Dr. Carla de Malanta, hindi ko dapat kalimutan, kasama ng mga oldies yon. Thank you also to the people from DOE, FIVOLCS, MGB, National Museum for joining us, and of course PNRI. So Betch, maybe it would be, if it's okay with you, pakisagot na rin yung tanong ni Mr. Soberano, ni Noel Soberano, doon sa question niya about the quantity daw of xenoliths. Would it be representative enough? Medyo mahaba yung sagot yan. Parang tanong din yan sa mga fossil sa amin. So, tanongin.
Universe na question.
Oo. So, pwede mo sigurong sagutin na lang siya sa chat, no? So we can now move on. So thank you very much, Dr. Aurelio and Dr. Payot, for your talks. Really very interesting.